Well, thank you very much for having, can you hear me okay? I apologize that I've come in late to this meeting. I just literally come from the airport, and having seen the people you've had presenting already, you're certainly getting some really excellent work in STS and more to come. I wasn't certain what to prepare for you, and I'm happy. We're just going to have, I think, a lot of discussion. Oleg has asked me to talk for only 20 minutes, so hopefully I'll say something provocative in this time. But for me, the big character of this field of STS, its characteristic, is that it's dominated by empirical studies. And throughout my life in this field, I've done one study after another. So it's always hard for me to talk about the concepts and the state of the field without talking about a particular study. So I will have one of my studies here, you'll see, so there will be empirical material presented. Okay, so you get a feel for this is how we do our STS. Okay, these are the big questions of what I call technology studies. And just a little bit of history here. A lot of people in this room here, Steve Woolgar, Andy Pickering and myself, started off in the field of what you might call pure science studies, looking at science as an endeavor, practice in science. Steve Woolgar famously at scientific laboratories, Andy Pickering and myself at controversies in science. And that was in the early part of my career. And the approach I developed in the sociology of technology, the social construction of technology, moved over some of those ideas developed in the sociology of scientific knowledge into the field of technology. And this is how I frame now the big questions of this field of technology studies, which is how does culture and society and technology interact? And in the old days, this was framed as the impact of technology on society, but now we're looking for relationships both ways. How culture and society gets into the black box of technology. A dominant theme in this field, and I think this case study will have something to say, what leads to the acceptance of new technological innovations? That's something that traditionally economists have looked at, but I think work in the social construction of technology has something to say to this. A particular case I'm going to look at, which is of a new electronic music technology, led to a whole new market. These devices hadn't been sold before, they had to be sold in new ways, and a new market developed. So it can also throw insight into how markets develop. And a bigger issue here is the link between technology and society. How do technologies transform, if we want to use, I'm using the Wittgenstein phrase, our form of life, but you can use other phrases. Just the general impact of technology on society is a wider general issue. I've been looking, the case study I've got is of a musical instrument technology. Now, when I started working on musical instrument technology, in particular the electronic music synthesizer, the chair of my department, Sheila Jasanoff, at Cornell University, said to me, "It's okay, Trevor, you've done lots of serious work, you can look at music now, it's okay." And the implication was that music technologies were something that were kind of irrelevant, shouldn't be looked at. Now, the insight I have, if there is one, into looking at musical instruments, is to think about musical instruments actually as technologies. And there's a quote from the main guy, the sort of grandfather of the electronic music synthesizer, Robert Moog, from my book on this subject, came out in 2002 with Harvard University Press, called Analog Days. And he just says musical instrument design is actually one of the most sophisticated, specialized technologies that we as humans have developed. And that has been my approach, to take ideas from the field of technology studies to apply them into this new area of musical instrumentation, to think about musical instrumentation in the ideas. So we're moving from science to technology, and now also to the field of music. And this is what I like to do. I like to move, and actually more generally, I'm not going to talk about this today, but I'm happy to talk about it. I've also moved to sound in general. I've just edited the Oxford Handbook of Sound Studies. So I'm particularly interested in sound as a phenomenon. Just as we have visual studies, we can have sound studies as well. And this is a technology of sound. Just to remind you, and if Sheila Jasanoff was here, who's a good friend of mine, I'd show her this slide, just to remind you that actually musical technologies are big news. If you're thinking of innovation, Silicon Valley and so on, I understand this is a theme that people are interested here at this meeting. This was Stanford University's second biggest patent ever, until gene splicing is their biggest patent ever. This is still their second biggest patent, is for a form of frequency modulated synthesis that's the guts of the DX7 synthesizer licensed to Yamaha. back in 1985. So just to remind you, there's a lot of money at stake with these sorts of technologies. Okay. So they're not just irrelevant, they're a pleasure technology. I think it's interesting because of that, but they are really important economic drivers as well. And if you just think about this as well, by the way, every cell phone that you have has a form of synthesizer embedded in it, has a music synthesizer embedded in your cell phones. We know that cell phones are one of the most ubiquitous technologies on the planet, again, just to show you the spread of it. Here's something interesting as well. They give the Grammys in America as a big thing for musicians. You know, Bob Dylan gets Grammy and so on. But they actually have technical Grammys. And the guy who invented the synthesizer, Robert Moog, in 2002, got it for his invention called the Mini Moog synthesizer. And Steve Jobs also went up to receive his at the same time. So when you start to think of people like Steve Jobs as a classic innovator, and if you think of the instruments that he's developed, just think of the iPod. It's a form of musical technology. How this is, one of the things technologies that transformed Apple as a company to be one of the wealthiest companies in the world in terms of valuation. This is the guy, Robert Moog, who's the inventor of this technology. There's a picture of him. He died in 2005. The Mini Moog synthesizer that he's famous for is this one at the front. This is what he got this going. This is the precursor of all music synthesizers today. This is, I see the template. This is the digital form of it, which is available today. This is still an analog instrument. It's a monophonic instrument, both of them, one note at a time. He developed this in early 1971, this Mini Moog synthesizer. But I see it as a portable keyboard instrument, as the precursor for all the other synthesizers that followed. And one of the reasons that the electronic music synthesizer is such an interesting technology is that new musical instruments don't come along very often. But you can buy synthesizers in music stores. It's one of the few new instruments. In fact, if you look back for the history of musical instruments, you see the electric guitar in the 20th century, but that's the application of electricity to the guitar. I think it's more interesting than that because Jimi Hendrix took the guitar in new directions and new sorts of sounds of feedback. But you have to go back for the next major instrument to Adolphe Sax in 1840. And Adolphe Sax produced the saxophone, which he designed for marching bands. And that instrument only took off in the 1930s with the development of jazz. So it's already telling you something about the innovation of new musical instruments, that something else has to happen in the culture for them to take off. And the thing that happens in the culture is a new music, jazz, takes off in the 1930s, leads to the saxophone getting established as an instrument. And Moog has a similar story. There's a new genre of music, psychedelic music, which is perfect for the Moog synthesizer, which develops in the 1960s. And it's this, it's the music and the technology together that are really important in this story. Those are the big Moog synthesizers. He first developed these outside my university, Ithaca, New York, Cornell, in 1966. They're like huge. They were gigantic. So they've become much more smaller now to have them in your cell phone. These were like old telephone exchangers. So they have sources of sound. You control these with these old patch wires. And he put a keyboard on it early on. This keyboard was very fortuitous for the direction of the technology. I did this study, by the way, interviewing people. This is a classic method in STS, going around interviewing people. I interviewed engineers and musicians from that period. This guy's name is Don Preston, who played synthesizer with Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Sometimes I add a pop-up quiz when I'm introducing this topic to say, what's the link between this and one of the most popular rock songs of all time, Smoke on the Water by Deep Purple, which if you ever played Guitar Hero, dun, 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 dun. Well, that song was for a casino in Switzerland that burnt down, where the Mothers of Invention were playing, and what actually happened was Don Preston, Frank Zappa's synthesizer player, this guy here, started a solo. Some Swiss guy got so excited by that solo on the Moog synthesizer, he burnt down the casino, which led to that song. That's the link to Smoke on the Water. Just interesting in terms of sound and how weird this was. This, not only is it a new technology coming into being, you have a new soundscape. And I asked Moog, what was the sound like? And here's just a quote from him. Just to give you, I like to give quotes because you can get a feel. We talked to these people. The door was open. We didn't have air conditioning, anything like that. It was late spring. People would walk by in there. They'd hear something. They'd stand there. They'd listen. They'd shake their heads, they'd listen again. What is this weird shit coming out of the basement? And this weird shit are the first sounds of the electronic music synthesizer. And you have to have new words to describe this. People had only been exposed to then by the sound of a Russian instrument, the theremin used in Hollywood, played without touching, an amazing instrument. And maybe they would have heard the work of John Cage, something like that, or Stockhausen. But most people hadn't heard electronic sounds back then. Now we're totally saturated with them. Now, in the social construction of technology, we have this thing which we took over from the sociology of science called interpretive flexibility. That in terms of science, that was that experimental results could be given different meanings, different interpretations. We call this a moment of interpretive flexibility. We have the same thing in the sociology, social construction of technology, that you have a moment of choice in the technology, two different meanings of the technology. When I started this research, I quickly found there was another synthesizer manufacturer on the West Coast, Don Buchler, who had a very different vision of electronic music synthesizers. His was still modular, the technology's voltage controls its transistors, but he rejected having the standard keyboard. He was influenced by theories like John Cage would talk about music, sweeps of sounds. We've got this new form of technology. Why be stymied by the conventional interface? And we know from the history of technology, sociology of technology, interfaces are really important. It's very conservative. The interface of the mouse is an incredible new way of interacting with a computer. The whole story of how the mouse was developed is a really interesting case study. So Buchler thought, why should we be stuck with keyboards? Let's think of these weird buttons here you could push, and they would produce different voltages. And you couldn't play in any conventional keys at all with this instrument. So there's these two rival visions, different aesthetic things built into them, different technologies. They have different forms of standards, as we'll get to in a moment, built into them. So you have this moment of interpretive flexibility. So the project in the social constructed technology, a very typical one, is to map out how you get closure or stabilization. And in this case, the Moog way of doing things with the keyboard becomes the dominant one, and Buchler becomes a niche market. Buchler's still out there with his weird synthesizers. Madonna bought one a couple of years ago. So they're very expensive. They're still used by performers, but it's not the dominant form that this technology took. If you like, you can think of this, another term that I think is useful to think as a path dependence starts to build towards built-in keyboard synthesizers. This is Robert Moog. He's a classic 50s engineer. He's always been identified by the pen protector. He's a real 50s guy. And this is a photograph from his early Trumansburg studio where they're developing these synthesizers. There's always keyboards in the photographs. So I asked him, why are keyboards there? And he says this: keyboards are always there. Whenever someone wants to take a picture for some reason or other, it looks good if you're playing a keyboard. People understand that then you're making music, you know. Without it, you could be tuning in Russia. Height of the Cold War, remember. So it's an obvious point that having the keyboard there makes it much more like a musical instrument. Moog's salesmen told him, the salespeople are really important as intermediaries here between the users and the producers, told them, stay with the keyboard, Bob, because most musicians have got some feel for a keyboard, even if it's monophonic. Closure, thank you. So you have this moment of interpretive flexibility, then you have closure. That's the way we think. In very simple terms, the synthesizer over time became a keyboard instrument to be used by all sorts of musicians. This is the vision, the path dependency that's developed around a keyboard instrument. And Moog became the dominant design, and Buchler relegated to this niche market. Now I want to talk about the role of users in this. This is an example. Bob Moog was very interested in what the users had to say about his keyboard. I'll get back to that slide in a second. First of all, I just want to talk about another feature. I'll get back to users in a moment. Standardization and ease of use. This technology is voltage control. That means you have these sources of sound called oscillators, and you say an oscillator is producing something like a sine wave. If you can feed that oscillator into another oscillator, you can produce something called frequency modulation. The oscillator, the other oscillator, the pitch of it will change, the frequency of it will change according to that voltage coming in. That's what voltage control is about. And Moog standardized the synthesizer. He had this idea of the keyboard and octaves around this standard that became a really important technical standard, the volt per octave. So 1 volt into an oscillator produced an octave change in pitch. I'm often asked, how does music culture, piece of culture, get embedded into technology? This is a really classic and good example of it, because music doesn't have to be about octaves. But Moog has got keyboards, he's thinking about music in terms of octaves. So here you have a piece of our culture embedded into a piece of technology. So music culture is built into technology. Buchler couldn't do this because he didn't have this keyboard, so he couldn't define it in terms of octaves. All the other synthesizers companies from that period onwards, well, this was the dominant technology, adopted this standard. So you see again the role of a standard how culture gets embedded in the technology, in particular standard, forming that, if you like, path dependency. Here's the bit about users. That other slide was out of order. Moog, he learned from his users. So when he had a synthesizer, he went down to New York City, where most of his customers were. We're very interested in the social construction of technology, in the role of users. Where there's been work on how users can reappropriate technology, how they're sources of design. Moog was very aware of this. He would install a synthesizer. So that previous slide, a thing called portamento, this sliding between keys, he got when he installed the synthesizer in a musician, Wendy Carlos' studio in New York. He brought musicians to his factory and learned from them. He'd offer them pieces of equipment. It's like a laboratory. He could learn from them. And he'd watch how they use it. He employed studio musicians. And he actually thought about cultivating the market with a magazine called Electronic Music Review, which later becomes Keyboard Magazine, for cultivating this new field of electronic music. Record reviews, things like this, as the records start to develop. Now, it wasn't that Moog did this as a business strategy. This is how he saw it. Another quote: all the people I did business in the early days remain collaborators, friends, customers. They've been very valuable to me. So he sees it just as this is what he's doing. No, it's not that it's like my business strategy is to cultivate users. That's our way of putting it in terms of the sociology of technology. But he kind of did it almost naturally, fell into it, hang out with these people. It's not clear who the users are going to be. This is another important thing with new technologies. You get new uses. So here's a new use. It starts to be used for advertisements. Coffee, a famous coffee one. Coke, sometimes when I have longer, I play a beer commercial. It was used for. So the sound of the Moog is used in advertising material. It starts to be used in movies. Star Wars, all the special effects for that famous movie Star Wars were done with a synthesizer. So this is the first use of synthesizers in movies. So you have new parts of culture where synthesizers are starting to spread into. That's Eric Sidé, one of the first customers, Moog's second ever customer, who made a famous Coke advert with it. The psychedelic, the music, we're going to get to that. That was a really important part of it. The Buchla was working in the middle of San Francisco, and this is a famous psychedelic festival called the Trips Festival from 1966. Steve Jobs was at this festival. This is where the counterculture eventually is going to lead to cyberculture. There's a very nice book on this by Fred Turner. And Buchla's synthesizer was right at the heart of this counterculture. The Grateful Dead, other bands like that were playing there. Thank you. Monterey Pops, another famous, this is where the tie-in between psychedelic music and the Moog synthesizer becomes established. You've probably seen this movie, Monterey Pops, you know, Jimi Hendrix burning his guitar, Janis Joplin's there, many classic bands. And these groups, various things were happening in the culture. These Moog synthesizers at this stage were very expensive. They're about the price of a small house. Monterey is where the recording industry, so you have a big industry, which was flush with money back then, discovers the psychedelic sound coming out of San Francisco and offers huge record advances. These are the days you could get record advances to these musicians. So they could afford to buy these Moog synthesizers. Moog had 2 salesmen set up at Monterey in a tent with amazing sounds, and these musicians, like Jim Morrison from The Doors, the Beatles representatives were there, would put these headphones on. They were also, by the way, stoned out of their minds, so the whole technology of drugs is another important part of this story. And they say, wow, we've got to have this sort of music on our next album. We've got to have this sound, these psychedelic washes of sound. So this was famously used by the Beatles in one of the most popular songs ever by the Beatles. You can see there's Paul McCartney. All the Beatles could play the Moog synthesizer, used on Abbey Road. A song called Here Comes the Sun has got 5 pieces of Moog synthesizer. If we had more time, I'd play and we could identify and listen. So it's this, remember, psychedelia was interested in new instruments, washes of sound, spacey sound. There's another classic group who used all Tonto's Expanding Headband from that period. Then the Moog starts to be taken off for all sorts of music. This is one of the best-selling Bach records ever, all done on the Moog. If you look in your parents' vinyl record collection, you might just find this record. Switched on Bach. You have it. Yeah, it's a classic. Bach is done by it. And then you have others like Switched on Nashville, Switched on Bacharach, more Switched on Bacharach, and of course Christmas records. So the Moog starts to be used for all sorts of genres of music. That's what, just a picture of Moog's factory. He used women, workers mainly. I'll skip this, but there's a difference between Buchla's part of the counterculture is very influenced by the drug culture. Moog is a 50s engineer, so they have these clash almost of these 2 people in each different place as well, which makes the story even more interesting for me. Then Moog, in 1970, he and his engineers produced this mini Moog. So this is a black boxed, if you like, hardwired, those big patch wires. It's much cheaper as well. Rock groups could start to afford to buy this synthesizer. And here, the selling of the synthesizer is really important because the Mini Moog synthesizer is the first synthesizer sold in retail stores. So in social constructed technology, we have to study new sorts of actors here. And these are actors that mediate between the users and the producers. And I think salespeople and repair people are really important people to study here. So how does it get into retail music stores, this synthesizer? Well, so this guy here, it's in my book, we haven't got much time. He's a TV evangelist, a former TV evangelist who hears the sound of the Moog synthesizer and decides to take it on synthesizers on the road. He first ties up with a guy, he's a friend with Glenn Bell, who owns Taco Bell, and this is the same time that Taco Bell is spreading into America. So there's a link between the Moog synthesizer and Taco Bell. The two link up together. Fascinating thing. But here's another really interesting aspect of this. Vancouver establishes off the coast of Florida on a man-made island, he calls it an island of electronicus. And this is like a laboratory for studying users. That's how I put it in terms of the sociology of technology. He'd invite people to come there. He had the very first mini Moogs, and he'd see how young people, young rock musicians, would start to use this instrument. And he'd learn from that how he could sell these instruments to them. And basically, to cut a long story short, he establishes in a classic way, here's a Cadillac, here's 6 mini Moogs, and he starts to establish a network of synthesizer sales around America. He drives around, establishes it, and he has a particularly interesting way of doing this because no one wants to sell a mini Moog synthesizer. It looks way too complicated, this technology. So he has to think of a way of demonstrating that it can actually, they're customers for this thing. It's like, imagine the violin, the first time, you've got no repertoire of music for the violin, and you bring it to a music store and say, I want to sell this thing. Well, it's going to sound like squeaky, it's hard to play. So you have to learn how to play. It's an interesting thing for a new instrument. How do you establish that you can even sell it? So he goes to the clubs, finds musicians, young musicians who can buy this. He works on the loan papers, identifies the girlfriend or the mother who might be able to sign up on this, because the guys themselves don't have enough money. Has the loan papers, takes them to the store and gives a new form of demonstration, demonstrates to the owner of the store, here is your first customer. And he did this in many, many different stores in America. So this is how the synthesizers get into retail music stores. 1 minute left, this is fine. So how does this new innovation, what does it require? It's a very complicated story. I wasn't able actually to tell you about this, but we didn't have time, but it involved new collaborations. Moog was an engineer, and he had to collaborate with musicians. So there's a new form of collaboration required. It requires this wider social movement, the psychedelia, to take off. This is an important part of it. That psychedelic explosion had happened, we probably wouldn't have that Moog synthesizer. New musical genres, psychedelic rock, later something called progressive rock, which is associated with that mini Moog. People like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Rick Wakeman, people like this. Standardization and ease of use is important. Familiar interfaces. The salespeople keep telling me, you've got to keep it a familiar interface. That booklet interface won't work. Moog has devised new ways to recruit and learn from the users, bringing them to his factory, watching how they actually, the musicians use the equipment. So he's developing the equipment as he watches the users. So new ways to recruit. And then, of course, with the selling of Vancouvering, I can think of Vancouvering. This salesman is basically recruiting new musicians to this new instrument. And then, of course, underlying this story, which I haven't been able to talk much about today, is a whole transformation in the soundscape. So the salesman says the sound of the mini Moog is there, it's everywhere. People can hear it and recognize it. So there's a whole interesting issue of how we attend to sound, how we recognize sound, how we associate sounds with particular instruments and so on. This is another whole sort of huge area that is ripe for, I can answer questions on sound studies. I'll be very happy to talk about that. And I think that's all we've got time for. So let's leave it there. Thanks. Yeah.